Imagine a massive industrial factory, right? It's billowing this dark smoke over a neighboring farm, and it's staining the local laundry, ruining the season's crop. Common sense, and honestly a century of standard economic theory, says the factory is the absolute villain here.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very comforting narrative.
Right, because the factory caused the damage, so naturally they should be taxed or penalized or sued to pay for it.
Yeah, the arrow of causality points in exactly one direction there. Action, then harm. We naturally just want to point our finger at the factory and say, you threw the metaphorical baseball through the window, so you pay for the glass.
Exactly. But today, we are questioning that exact intuition. We're asking a deceptively simple question. When a business activity harms a neighbor, who is actually responsible? And, well, how should society resolve it? We are tackling the framework laid out by R.H. Coase in his 1960 paper, The Problem of Social Cost.
A brilliant paper.
It really is. And I'll be defending the traditional economic view, the one pioneered by Arthur Pigo. This perspective argues that the entity inflicting the harm, they just have to be held liable or regulated, to internalize the cost of their actions, or else markets fail.
Right. And I will be defending Coase's counterintuitive and, frankly, revolutionary perspective. I'll argue that harm is actually reciprocal in nature.
Well, let's start by looking at the traditional approach. This stems largely from Arthur Pigou's highly influential theories on welfare economics. Pigou basically articulated something that aligns perfectly with basic accountability.
The divergence between private and social products, right?
Exactly. When a business inflicts damage on others, there is a massive divergence between the private product and the social product, meaning the numbers on the company's private ledger look fantastic, but the ledger for society as a whole is taking a massive unrecorded loss.
They're just shifting the cost.
Exactly. Take a classic example. A railway company runs steam engines across the countryside, and the engines inevitably throw off sparks. Those sparks occasionally burn down the woods on neighboring farm properties.
Which is a huge problem for the farmers.
Right. The railway profits immensely from running the trains. That is their private product, but they are throwing severe costs onto farmers who have absolutely nothing to do with the railway business.
Yeah.
So Piku's argument is that without liability laws or taxes, the railway has zero financial incentive to install spark-preventing devices on their smokestacks. They just have no incentive to run fewer trains during a dry season.
Because they reap all the benefits while the farmers absorb all the costs.
Right, and therefore the state must step in. We have to make the damaging business liable. If your railway burns out a forest, well, your railway pays for the timber.
Internalizing the cost.
Exactly. Suddenly, installing a spark arrestor makes financial sense to them. It's about correcting a clear market failure, ensuring that a business only operates if its total benefits exceed its total costs to society.
I come at it from a completely different way, though. Coase looks at this traditional Pigovian approach, and he argues that it fundamentally obscures the true nature of the choice society is making here.
How so?
Well, we've been conditioned to look at the railway and the farmer and ask, A inflicts harm on B, so how should we restrain A? Coase says that this is the completely wrong question. We are dealing with a problem of reciprocal nature.
Reciprocal? I mean, I fail to see how a train violently setting fire to someone else's property is reciprocal. The farmer isn't throwing sparks at the train.
Right, but that's because you are only looking at the physical sparks. You aren't looking at the economic reality. Think about it. To avoid the harm to the woods owner, what must we actually do?
We stop the sparks?
Yes, but by doing that, we must inflict harm on the railway. By forcing the railway to run fewer trains, or forcing them to install heavy, expensive equipment that slows down transit, we are reducing the supply of valuable transportation services for the entire economy.
But that is a cost they should bear for being reckless.
But that assumes they are inherently in the wrong. The real question is not how to stop the railway. The real question is, should the railway be allowed to harm the woods, or should the woods be allowed to harm the railway by restricting its operation?
That is definitely a different way to frame it.
Exactly. The goal of society must be to avoid the more serious harm overall. Coase's core thesis is that if the pricing system works smoothly, the free market will actually negotiate its way to the most efficient solution. And that happens regardless of who is held legally liable by the courts.
Okay, that is a massive, highly counterintuitive claim. Let's move this from abstract theory into a concrete legal scenario to see if that logic actually holds up. The classic English legal case of Sturgis versus Bridgman is a perfect stress test for this idea.
Oh, the confectioner and the doctor. This is where human intuition really gets turned completely upside down.
Let's lay out the fact. We have a confectioner, right, a candy maker in London. He's been operating 2 large, heavy mortars and pestles in his kitchen for over 60 years. He is a very established business.
A fixture of the neighborhood.
Exactly. Then a doctor comes to occupy the neighboring premises. For 8 years, they exist side by side without a single problem. But eventually, the doctor decides to expand his practice. So he builds a brand new consulting room at the very end of his garden.
Right up against the property line.
Yep, sharing a physical wall with the confectioner's industrial kitchen. And suddenly, we have a massive crisis. The noise and vibration from the confectioner's machinery are just vibrating right through the newly built wall.
Right, it's so loud that the doctor cannot physically use his stethoscope to listen to his patient's lungs.
Exactly. It completely prevents him from engaging in any medical work requiring thought and attention. So the doctor takes the confectioner to court, demanding an injunction to force him to stop using the machinery.
Naturally.
Right. And applying the traditional Pigovian view, and frankly just common sense, the confectioner's machines are the undeniable source of the vibration. The candy maker's actions are causing the harm to the doctor's practice. Therefore, the confectioner should be restrained.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why, and it goes right to the heart of reciprocity. Did the confectioner's heavy machinery cause the vibration? Obviously, yes.
Right.
But the doctor also caused the problem. He chose to build a quiet consulting room right against a kitchen wall that had housed heavy industrial machinery for over half a century.
I challenge that framing entirely, though. The doctor owns his land. He has a fundamental legal right to build a room on his own property without having his walls shaken apart.
Yeah, but the confectioner owns his land, too, and he has a right to operate his long-standing business. Think about Coase's observation here. There would absolutely be no nuisance without the confectioner's machinery, but there would also be no nuisance without the doctor's newly built consulting room.
So you're saying they both cause it?
Both parties cause the damage, yes.
But how can a man sitting quietly in a room with a stethoscope be causing damage? I mean, he's just sitting there.
Because by demanding silence, he is destroying the candy maker's ability to produce goods. If we legally stop the machinery, we harm the confectioner and deprive society of candy. If we let the machinery run, we harm the doctor and deprive society of medical diagnoses.
Right.
We are simply making a choice here. Does society, at this specific geographic point, want more confectionery products, or do we want more doctoring?
So you are basically treating the right to make noise and the right to have silence as equal inputs.
Precisely. They are both factors of production. Just like flour and sugar are inputs for the candy, the ability to make noise is a necessary input for the candy.
And silence for the doctor.
Exactly. Just like a stethoscope is an input for the doctor, ambient silence is a necessary input for him. They are competing for the exact same physical resource, which is the acoustic environment of that property line. It is a reciprocal clash of economic rights, not a melodrama about a villain and a victim.
Well, even if I grant you that the harm is reciprocal, this raises a massive practical question. If both parties are causing the harm, how does a society actually resolve the clash without a centralized judge dictating every single outcome?
That brings us to the most famous thought experiment in Coase's work, the neighboring farmer and the cattle raiser. This is where we see how the market actually resolves these clashes.
Let's dig into the arithmetic of this, because the traditional view provides a very clean solution here. We have a cattle raiser and a farmer operating on neighboring properties, right? And there's no fence between them?
A classic setup.
Exactly. The cattle inevitably wander over and eat some of the farmer's crops. Let's say the cattle raiser has a herd of 2 steers, and he is considering adding a 3rd steer. He runs the numbers and realizes that adding this 3rd steer will generate him $2 of profit from the extra meat.
Okay, $2.
Right. However, that third steer will wander over and destroy $3 worth of the farmer's crops.
So the damage exceeds the profit.
Exactly. Now, under the traditional Pagovian system, the cattle raiser is held legally liable for the damage his cows cause. He looks at his ledger and says, I make $2 in profit, but the law forces me to pay $3 in crop damages.
That's a net loss of $1.
Exactly. Therefore, he does not raise the third steer. The system works perfectly. The inefficient steer, which destroys more societal value than it creates, is prevented. Regulation and liability save the day.
That is the traditional outcome, yes. But Coase introduces the twist that completely shattered the economic consensus.
Which is?
What if the cattle raiser is not liable? What if the law explicitly says the cattle raiser has the right to let his cows roam free, and he doesn't owe the farmer a single dime for any destroyed crops? Coase mathematically proves that the exact same optimal number of cattle will be raised.
I see why you think that works in a vacuum, but let me give you a different perspective. That basically defies basic human incentive.
How so?
If the cattle raiser faces zero financial penalty for crop damage, he has every incentive to expand his herd indefinitely. He makes $2 on the steer, pays nothing for the damage, and the farmer is just left bankrupt. Why would he ever stop adding cattle?
Because you are treating the farmer like a passive victim instead of a rational economic actor. Let's walk through the exact same arithmetic, but with zero liability.
Okay, let's hear it.
The cattle raiser wants to add the third steer. It will yield him $2 of profit. It will cause $3 of damage to the farmer. Under the law, the cattle raiser does not have to pay for that damage.
So he adds the steer, makes his $2, and the farmer loses $3.
No, he doesn't. Think about what the farmer will do. The farmer looks at the situation and realizes, if that third steer is raised, I lose $3. I should just go over to the cattle raiser's house and pay him not to raise it.
Wait, you're saying the victim pays the perpetrator to stop?
Strip away the moral labels of victim and perpetrator. Just look at the math. The farmer can offer the cattle raiser a bribe, let's say $2.50, to simply not breed that third steer.
Oh, I see.
Right. The cattle raiser is offered $2.50 to do nothing. But that is 50 cents more than the $2 profit he would have made from raising the steer and selling the meat. As a rational actor, he takes the deal.
And the farmer pays $2.50 to save $3 worth of crops. So the farmer is also 50 cents better off than if he had just let the steer trample his field.
Exactly. Both parties are financially better off. And most importantly for society, the physical reality is identical.
The steer isn't raised.
Right. The inefficient third steer is not raised. The exact same amount of meat is produced, and the exact same amount of crops are preserved as in your liability scenario.
So you are telling me that the ultimate allocation of resources, like the actual physical production of the economy, is completely identical whether the cattle raiser is strictly liable or completely immune from liability.
It is a stunning realization. If the pricing system works efficiently, the market will always negotiate its way to maximizing the total value of production. The only thing the legal liability changes is the initial distribution of wealth, who has to pay whom.
Right.
But the inefficient steer never gets raised either way.
Okay, that is an elegant mathematical model. But I am not convinced by that line of reasoning for the actual world we live in, because it relies on a massive, glaring assumption.
Which assumption?
Coase is assuming that the pricing system works smoothly or, costlessly. He is assuming the farmer and the cattle raiser can just lean over the fence and casually hand over $2.50. But what happens when we scale this up?
Ah, you're talking about transaction costs.
I am talking about astronomical transaction costs. Let's go back to my factory example. A factory is emitting smoke that causes mild lung irritation to, say, 10,000 different citizens in a surrounding city.
Okay.
Under Coase's theory, if the factory's production is worth less than the collective medical bills of the town, the 10,000 citizens should just band together and pay the factory to install a scrubber. But in reality, organizing 10,000 people is a logistical nightmare.
Sure, it is.
You have to discover who's affected, overcome the free rider problem where no one wants to chip in, hire lawyers, conduct negotiations, you have to draft a massive legal contract, and undertake daily inspections to make sure the factory isn't secretly turning off the scrubber at night.
Well, Coase fully admits that costless market transactions are a highly unrealistic assumption.
And because it's unrealistic, the Pigovian model becomes an absolute necessity. When the administrative costs of bargaining are higher than the value of the bribe itself, the market freezes. The victims can't organize to pay the factory, so the factory just keeps polluting, even if it's wildly inefficient.
I see your point.
In the real world, direct government regulation, zoning laws, and strict liability are the only ways to cut through those insurmountable transaction costs. The government steps in as a sort of super firm to bypass the impossible negotiations and simply decree the efficient outcome.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the fatal flaw in that super firm concept? Yes, Coase explicitly concedes that when market transaction costs are too high, the initial legal delimitation of rights matters immensely.
Right.
The courts or the government absolutely have a role to play. However, we cannot fall into the trap of assuming that the government is a perfect, frictionless alternative.
Nobody is saying the government is perfect, but it has the coercive power to stop a systemic harm that a fractured market cannot stop. Think about the traffic light analogy that Arthur Pigou himself used.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a motorist approaches an intersection. The light is red, but he can clearly see there are no cars coming in any direction. If the motorist ignores the red light and drives through, no accident occurs. His private product increases because he gets to his destination faster, and in that specific instance, no one is harmed.
But a police officer will still pull him over and fine him.
Absolutely. We fine him because his private benefit is drastically lower than the systemic social risk he creates. We don't want to live in a society where every individual driver does their own on-the-fly calculus about whether a red light applies to them today.
Fair enough.
The transaction costs of verifying every driver's judgment are too high, so we impose a blanket regulation. We conceive of an ideal, regulated world where everyone stops at the red light, and society is far safer as a result, even if it forces a few cars to idle at an empty intersection.
And Coase argues that this exact traffic light analogy exposes the ultimate flaw in Pigou's entire economic philosophy. Pigou is constantly comparing the actual messy, real-world market, where organizing 10,000 citizens is hard, to an imaginary, pristine, ideal world of government regulation.
An ideal world.
Yes, a world where politicians perfectly calculate risk and bureaucrats enforce rules without friction. Coase warns us strictly against comparing reality to a whiteboard drawing.
How is it a whiteboard drawing? Governments enforce emission standards and zoning laws every single day.
But government administrative machines are not costless. They can be astonishingly wasteful. They are fallible. They're subject to immense political lobbying from the very factories they are supposed to regulate.
Well, sure, lobbying happens.
And by their nature, as you just admitted with the traffic light, they operate by applying broad, blanket rules. A zoning board might ban all industrial activity in a neighborhood, wiping out highly efficient, quiet businesses alongside the loud ones. The administrative bloat and the stifling of innovation can be catastrophic.
So you're saying we have to compare the actual costs of the market failing against the actual costs of the government regulating.
Precisely. We have to look at the world as it actually exists. Sometimes, yes, the market transaction costs are too high, and the smoke causes real harm that a targeted law can efficiently fix.
Right.
But sometimes, the cost of the government regulation itself is worse than the harm caused by the smoke. We cannot just point at a deficiency in the free market, label it a failure, and automatically assume a government bureaucracy will be an improvement. We have to compare total social products under both imperfect systems.
That brings us to a crucial point of reflection on this entire debate. From my perspective, defending the traditional Pigovian view, I will readily admit that Coase's reciprocal framework is an intellectual masterpiece.
It really changes how you see things.
And that we are ultimately just choosing between competing factors of production, like the doctor's silence versus the confectioner's noise. It fundamentally changes how you analyze a conflict.
Absolutely.
However, I maintain that Pigou's intuitive approach of assigning liability and utilizing regulation remains a highly practical necessity because transaction costs are very real. And organizing thousands of affected neighbors is often practically impossible. We cannot rely on people to simply bargain it out optimally.
The friction is too high.
Exactly. The state must often act as the arbiter to protect societal welfare when the market is paralyzed by its own friction.
And to summarize the Coasean perspective, I'd say clinging to that intuitive A harms B mindset blinds us to economic reality. It makes us vengeful rather than efficient.
Vengeful is a strong word, but I see your point.
Well, it's true. When we recognize that factors of production are essentially just competing rights, the right to clean air versus the right to emit smoke, the right to quiet versus the right to run machinery, we can finally strip away the moralizing.
Right.
It allows us to see that the true goal of society should be maximizing the total value of production, and we have to accept the deeply uncomfortable truth that sometimes maximizing total value means allowing the harm to continue.
Because stopping it would destroy something even more valuable.
Exactly.
I think where both of these frameworks converge is the realization that simple linear thinking is dangerous in economics. Arthur Pigou treated complex social ecosystems as isolated variables. Coase proved that any policy decision, whether it's a tax, a zoning law, or a liability ruling, creates massive secondary ripples.
You can't just change one thing.
Right. We can't just aggressively try to eliminate a specific nuisance without looking at the total effect on the social arrangement.
Agreed. Coase didn't just write an abstract economic paper. He fundamentally changed how modern legal systems approach property rights. He brought the law and the market into the exact same room, forcing judges to consider the economic weight of their rulings.
It is a profound paradigm shift. So the next time you look out your window and see a baseball shatter your living room glass, before you march over to the neighbor's house demanding a check, well, pause for a second.
Take a breath.
Ask yourself, are you merely the victim of their child's poor aim, or is the child the victim of your decision to build a house made of fragile glass right next to a baseball diamond?
I'm not sure that argument will hold up in small claims court, but it is certainly a Coasean way to look at a broken window.
We will leave it there for you to decide. Thanks for joining us.